Good afternoon, and thank you for coming this afternoon. My name is John Bodner, and I'm with the Institute for Advanced Study. I'm just here to say hello and welcome. This is a Branigin lecture. The Branigin lecture series has been sponsored by the Institute for Advanced Studies with an endowment for a number of years. And we've had a number of Branigin lectures on campus this fall, including several devoted to questions pertaining to this fall's election. And there will be more in the spring and more next year, but that's for another day and another time to discuss. So I will turn the podium over to Sonia Stevens, who will introduce our speaker for today. Thank you.
Thank you. It's truly an honor and a privilege to introduce Colin Davis this afternoon. Colin Davis was a research fellow at the University of Cambridge before moving to his first academic position in the University of Oxford, where he served as chair of the Faculty Board of Modern Medieval Languages. He then moved to the University of Warwick as Professor of French and Chair before taking up the position of Research Professor in the University of London and Chair of the Research Committee in the School of Modern Languages at Royal Holloway. He is co-editor of the prestigious journal French Studies and has recently been appointed editor of the Legenda series in the Modern Languages, published by the European Humanities Research Association in Oxford. He's been a visiting scholar at Stanford University and a visiting professor at the École Normale Supérieure in Lyon, as well as now at the Indiana University in Bloomington. I have had the privilege of working with him as a colleague on both sides of the Atlantic and have long acquaintance with his work, and it's truly a pleasure to welcome him to Bloomington. It's unusual for so young a scholar to have reached a stage in his career when he already has too many publications for them to be mentioned individually or even enumerated. And the presenter's recourse in this situation is often just to give a count rather than an account. Colin Davis is a specialist in 20th century French literature and thought and has, over the past 20 years, published 7 books and over 50 articles and essays. His latest book, his 8th, Scenes of Love and Murder, Renoir, Film and Philosophy, is due out early next year, and his talk today is drawn from his current project, Critical Excess, I'm not going to read the full title, under contract with Stanford University Press. His work focuses on fiction and its relationship to French philosophy of the 20th century, including questions of ethics, post-structuralism, deconstruction, and psychoanalysis. He's particularly known for his original approach to the work of Levinas and his interpretations of French fiction in the light of this, for narrative theory and philosophy, Holocaust studies, and for his work on the ethical turns of theory and criticism. Colin Davis's work has been welcomed by scholars for the freshness of his approach, even to subjects one might have thought well worked. What's so remarkable about his work is the complex turns of the argument and the critical range he demonstrates, the cogency and lucidity of his arguments, and the elegance of his prose. He demonstrates a rare ability to maneuver between fiction and philosophy, between thinkers and their ideas, between text and context, and always with elegance, critical honesty, and a wry humour. It's no overstatement to say that he's one of the most important critics of 20th century French literature and thought, that his influence on the field has been wide in scope and has changed the way we read and understand the literature and thought of the period. Today, in the context of this Branigin lecture, he'll talk on the subject, In Praise of Overreading. Please join me in welcoming Colin Davis.
Thank you. I hope that was being filmed, because that's the only part of this that I want to see again. After that very generous and gracious introduction, this is going to be a disappointment. But there is a clip from a Capra movie coming along, so if it gets heavy going, there's something to look forward to about halfway through. In Praise of Overreading. In the course of a discussion of a poem by Stefan George, the German philosopher Martin Heidegger pauses in a moment of uncharacteristic self-doubt. The danger exists, he says, that we overstrain such a poem, that we think too much into it and block ourselves off from being moved by the poetic. So our search to make sense of things might get in the way of our ability to experience them in their true power. Heidegger, though, quickly recovers his composure He writes, "But to tell the truth, there is an even greater danger, unwillingly admitted today, that we think too little and struggle against the thought that the authentic experience with language can only be the thinking experience, the more so as the high poetry of every great poem always soars in a thinking." So, in a way, for Heidegger, overstraining the poem turns out to be the only way of reading it properly, the only way of responding authentically to the thought of the poem, which, in Heidegger's peculiar resolution of the ancient quarrel between philosophy and poetry, is the poem's inner truth. What Heidegger calls overstraining the poem is what I'm calling here overreading or overinterpretation. It's always open to the charge that it distorts or falsifies what it purports to describe, or that it privileges the act of interpretation over due fidelity to what we're supposed to be interpreting. It puts the cart before the horse, as it were. To stay with Heidegger for a moment longer, this danger is well illustrated by an interesting exchange which took place after the first edition of his Elucidations of Hölderlin's poetry was published in 1951. In his discussion of Hölderlin's As When on a Holiday, Heidegger makes the following statement, quote, "The text of Hölderlin's poem, which shall serve here as the basis for the present lecture, and which has been repeatedly checked against the original manuscripts, rests upon the following attempt at an interpretation." So to simplify what he says there, the text rests upon the interpretation. In 1953, a doctoral student named Detlev Lüders wrote to Heidegger querying this sentence. Heidegger seems to be claiming that the poem, which is the subject of his lecture, is in fact grounded in his interpretation of it, rather than the other way around. Surely an interpretation should be based on a text, not a text based upon an interpretation. Heidegger wrote back to the student immediately, entirely conceding the point in his opening sentence. Heidegger writes, "You are right." First words, "You are right." The cited sentence is impossible in the present version. If there should be a new version, I will strike it, says Heidegger. As he continues, though, it seems that Heidegger is a little less wholehearted in accepting that he was in error. Merely to reverse the sentence so that it would read, "The following attempt at an interpretation is based upon the text," would make it banal and superfluous. And anyway, Heidegger insists, I quote, "The question what a text is, how one should read it, and when it is completely established as a text, of course, still remains." So having begun with a blunt confession that his correspondent was right, Heidegger ends with a question which implies that the student might be wrong after all. Is there a text in itself, Heidegger asks. Two more editions of Elucidations of Hölderlin's poetry appeared in Heidegger's lifetime, and in neither does Heidegger make good his undertaking to delete the offending sentence. We have no way of knowing whether he forgot or whether he decided after all that he wanted to retain the suggestion that the interpretation has priority over the poem. What is at issue here is the extent to which the thinker more or less willfully appropriates the poem for his own purposes, rather than attending earnestly to its distant, barely audible otherness. Although Heidegger wants, I quote, "to let the poem sing out of its own peace," he's fully aware that the commentary might in fact disturb what it is the poem has to say. It somehow feels outrageous, shocking, that for whatever reason Heidegger failed to honour his undertaking to revise the claim that the interpretation grounds the poem. And yet, he also insists that he and the poet are saying the same thing, one poetically, the other thoughtfully. This issue takes us to the heart of the problem of how we should interpret literary texts or films or the deceivingly banal incidents of our everyday lives. How do we distinguish between what is really there in the work or the world from what we add to it? How do we curb our limitless desire for meaning and put a brake on what can easily veer into the madness of interpretation? In a series of lectures on the relations between texts and readers published in the volume Interpretation and Overinterpretation, Umberto Eco proposes what appear to be unobjectionable conditions for interpretation to occur. This is Eco. If there is something to be interpreted, the interpretation must speak of something which must be found some way, somewhere, and in some way respected. So if there is something to be interpreted, the interpretation must speak of something which must be found somewhere and in some way respected. So first of all, there must be something which is out there in the world, available to be interpreted. We must then find it and respect it, in the sense that our interpretation must be appropriate to it and not arbitrarily imposed on it. This provides then limits to the range of possible interpretations, but does not unduly restrain it. Eco's use of something, somewhere, in some way, refrains from pinning down the object of interpretation and the means of interpreting it to specific identities and rules. In this account, there is some freedom in interpretation, some scope for imagination and dispute, even if the range of possible meanings is not entirely open. Eco hints here at what he elaborates in the rest of his lectures, that is, a sensible hermeneutic which allows for multiple readings but does not endorse interpretive anarchy. How could anyone possibly object to this in theory or justify departing from it in practice? But of course they do. Eco's views do not command universal assent. Indeed, if they did, I would have nothing to say to you today. In the exchange following Eco's lectures, the philosopher Richard Rorty and the literary critic, the literary theorist Jonathan Culler immediately take him to task, albeit for quite different reasons. Rorty suggests that Eco's view requires that there is something in the text, some meaning and internal coherence, which pre-exists and moulds its subsequent deciphering. However, Rorty insists, I quote, "The coherence of the text is not something it has before it is described. It is the description of the coherence of the text which makes that coherence." It's not possible to separate, for Rorty, the text and its meaning from our interpretation and use of it. The notion of overinterpretation is then redundant for Rorty because it falsely implies that we have a reliable distinction between what is in the text and what is merely supplied by a willful interpreter, and therefore that we have some measure for ascertaining which interpretations may be correct. In the absence of such a distinction, there is no essential difference for Rorty between reading and overreading. There are just more or less interesting and useful acts of interpretation. And in parenthesis, I should say that the title of Rorty's essay, In Defense of Overinterpretation, is one of the sources of my title here today, In Praise of Overreading. I decided, though, that I wanted to praise rather than to defend. To my mind, defense concedes too much, too quickly, by accepting that overinterpretation is in need of justification. The other source of my title is, of course, Erasmus's In Praise of Folly, and perhaps what I'm asking for here today is indeed a little more folly and risk in our academic endeavours. So back to the debate with Eco. Culler, unlike Rorty, accepts that there may be such a practice as overinterpretation, and he sets out to defend it. Moderate interpretation, he says, guided by widely accepted principles and yielding widely accepted results, articulates a consensus which is in fact of little interest. Culler insists, I quote, "Interpretation is interesting only when it is extreme." Extreme interpretation may of course turn out to be as dull and ineffective as its moderate counterpart, but if successful, it pushes thinking into new domains. It puts pressure on its objects in order to uncover things which might have remained hidden. It gives fresh insight into language, literature, and ourselves. Whereas for Rorty, there is no such thing as overinterpretation. For Culler, the notion remains valuable because it is through overinterpretation that new questions are asked, new answers discovered, new paradigms created. Echo describes as, I quote, an excess of wonder, the inclination to treat as significant what might simply be fortuitous. Colour argues that this excess of wonder is what he calls a quality to be cultivated rather than shunned. Without it, we will only incessantly rediscover what we already know. And anyway, today's overinterpretation may turn out to be tomorrow's consensus. So overreading involves pressing the meaning of a text to the very limit of surface plausibility, and then further still. My list of preferred overreaders includes Jacques Derrida, Gilles Deleuze, Emmanuel Levinas, Slavoj Žižek, and Stanley Cavell. Now, I can't, of course, talk about all of them in any detail today, so instead, to give a flavour of what overreading might look like in practice, I'm going to take a short example from Derrida and then a more extended one from Cavell. The example from Derrida is his virtuoso display in J'ai oublié mon parapluie, I've forgotten my umbrella, the section which closes the discussion of Nietzsche in Derrida's book Éperons, Spurs. This text, I've forgotten my umbrella, does certainly show Derrida at his most playful. Indeed, he adds a postscript to the text which is dated the 1st of April, which suggests perhaps that the whole thing may have been an April Fool's joke all along. But the joke is entirely serious. Derrida notes that the sentence, J'ai oublié mon parapluie, contained in quotation marks, has been found in Nietzsche's papers, Nietzsche's posthumous papers, and published. Derrida wonders whether it was a quotation, something Nietzsche had heard somewhere, or something he intended to elaborate on. In any case, there's no way of knowing for certain what he meant by it, or even whether he meant anything by it. Perhaps it wasn't even written by Nietzsche. The phrase is entirely legible. We all know what it means. And yet it remains secretive. It is open to interpretation, for example in psychoanalytical terms, and yet no interpretation will ever be certain to have finally settled its meaning. To this point, Derrida's musings might seem reasonable enough, and we might be led to think merely that Nietzsche's editors were overzealous or naive to publish the phrase at all. But Derrida then makes two moves which significantly extend the scope of his discussion. First, he suggests that all Nietzsche's writing might in fact be like J'ai oublié mon parapluie, that is, apparently readable, but also parodic, undecidable, providing us with no secure context or code for its deciphering, and therefore unreadable at the same time as it gives itself to be read. Then Derrida takes his suggestion still further. What if his own text were also like J'ai oublié mon parapluie? His essay on Nietzsche, all his writing indeed, might be governed by a code which only he knew, or which not even he knew, which he himself did not properly understand. Even if he explained it to us, we would never know whether or not to believe him. So the text would remain, quoting Derrida, indefinitely open, cryptic and parodic, that is to say, closed, open and closed at the same time or in turn. In the course of a few pages, then, Derrida has dramatically raised the stakes of interpretation. He's gone from illustrating the problems of making sense out of one of Nietzsche's apparently trivial posthumous fragments to suggesting the inherent secretiveness of Nietzsche's and his own writing, and by implication perhaps of everyone else's as well. Derrida's wild hermeneutic ends by undoing the hermeneutic project as such. The second example I want to take of overreading is from Stanley Cavell's essay on Frank Capra's film It Happened One Night, published in Cavell's Pursuits of Happiness. According to Cavell, It Happened One Night has in common with other examples of what he calls the comedy of remarriage, that it concerns the education of a woman who is willing to learn and who, through the acknowledgement of her desire, can finally emerge as an autonomous human being. This claim in itself may be relatively uncontroversial. What marks out Cavell's reading, though, is his treatment of the film and its themes in the context of the thought of Immanuel Kant. The chapter on the film of In Pursuit of Happiness begins with an exposition which is actually a very clear, succinct exposition of Kant's theory of knowledge. So Cavell's first important interpretive move here consists in establishing a link between the concerns of philosophy and the themes of comedy or melodrama. Early in the essay on It Happened One Night, Cavell achieves this by relating the problem of knowledge to that of marriage. This is Cavell. Two of the fundamental human properties that human societies have been most anxious to limit are the capacity to relate oneself to the world by knowledge and the capacity to relate oneself to others by marriage. In one sentence, then, Cavell collides epistemology with Hollywood romance. He relates their two key questions: what can we know, and whom should we marry? Quite a live question. This also brings together the two aspects of skepticism which have been Cavell's career-long concern, namely the knowledge we can have of the external world and the knowledge we can have of other selves. These issues are in turn related to divisions between the public and the private, that which is intimate and untouchable, and that which is open and available to all. And this then leads to the discussion of Kant, the philosopher most associated with the limitation of human knowledge. In Kant's critique of pure reason, the limitation of knowledge is envisaged as both a loss and a gain. According to Kant, the world of things in themselves is forever closed to us. We can know things only as they appear, not as they are essentially and absolutely. In the terms used by Kant, the phenomenal is knowable to us, whilst the noumenal remains forever outside our grasp. But in understanding the impenetrability of the noumenal, we've also learned something of the greatest importance. We've acquired a knowledge of the very conditions of knowledge insofar as it is available to us. Cavell calls this a traumatic increase. It is an increase because we've learned something, but it's traumatic. There is an unmovable limit to what we can know, a barrier forever separating the knowable from the unknowable. We can survey that barrier from the standpoint of our human finitude, but we can never step beyond it. Now, the question of barriers and whether one can step beyond them now becomes the central concern of Cavell's reading of Capra's It Happened One Night. And at this point, if the technology is willing, I'd like to show a 5-minute clip, which is the key clip from the film that Cavell talks about. If you don't know the film, it's a scene in which the runaway heiress, played by Claudette Colbert, a runaway heiress is being pursued by a reporter who wants her story, a reporter played by Clark Gable. For various reasons too complicated to go into, they end up in a hotel room on a wet night. They don't have enough money for 2 hotel rooms, so they're going to spend the night together in the hotel.
That, I suppose, makes everything quite all right.
Well, this? Well, I like privacy when I retire. Yes, I'm very delicate in that respect. Prying eyes annoy me. Behold the walls of Jericho. Maybe not as thick as the ones that Joshua blew down with his trumpet, but a lot safer. You see, I have no trumpet. Now, just to show you my heart's in the right place, I'll give you my best pair of pajamas. Do you mind joining the Israelites? You don't want to join the Israelites? All right. Perhaps you're interested in how a man undresses. You know, there's a funny thing about that. Quite a study in psychology. No 2 men do it alike. You know, I once knew a man who kept his hat on until he was completely undressed. Yeah, now he made a picture. Years later, his secret came out. He wore a toupee. Yeah. You know, I have a method all my own. If you notice, the coat came first, then the tie, then the shirt. Now, according to Hoyle, after that, the pants should be next. Here's where I'm different. I go for the shoes next. First the right, then the left. After that, It's every man for himself. Still with me, Brett? Ah, don't be a sucker. Good night's rest will do you a lot of good. Besides, you got nothing to worry about. The walls of Jericho will protect you from the big bad wolf. Who's afraid of the big bad wolf? The big bad wolf? The big bad wolf? She's afraid of the big bad wolf. Tra-la-la-la-la.
Would you mind, please, putting out the lights?
No, not at all. We should take those things off the walls of Jericho.
Oh, excuse me. By the way, what's your name?
What's that?
Who are you?
Who, me? I'm the whippoorwill that cries in the night. I'm the soft morning breeze that caresses your lovely face.
You've got a name, haven't you?
Yeah, I got a name. Peter Warren.
Peter Warren. I don't like it.
I'm going to call you. You're giving it back to me in the morning.
Pleased to meet you, Mr. Warren.
The pleasure is all mine, Mrs. Warren.
Okay, so I'll phrase it there at the point at which the blanket divides the room into two separate spaces. Town One Night was released in 1934, just before the Hays Code began to be strictly enforced. And there are some things in that which they probably wouldn't have got away with 6 months later. Now, the essential question here for Cavell is to do with barriers, the blanket. In this key scene, the runaway heiress, played by Claudette Colbert, and the reporter, played by Clark Gable, prepare to spend a night together in a motel room. The Gable character attaches a cord between the twin beds in the room and hangs a blanket over it, thereby dividing the room into two separate spaces. Gable explains that he does not want to be overseen. He says, "Well, I like privacy when I retire. Yes, I'm very delicate in that respect. Prying eyes annoy me." He describes the blanket as the walls of Jericho and proceeds to undress, at which point Colbert withdraws to her own side of the room. On his side of the blanket, Gable can see the signs of her undressing as the blanket moves when she touches against it. She hangs some clothes over the blanket, but then moves them when asked by Gable. With them both lying in their separate beds, Colbert realizes that she does not even know the name of the man she's spending the night with. And she asks, "Who are you?" as if setting up the barrier between them is the condition by which they might begin to learn each other's identity. The scene ends with a shot of Gable and Colbert in their beds, separated by the blanket which divides the room, and the drama of the rest of the film is whether and how the walls of Jericho, that is, the barrier separating private selves, can be breached. We know full well, of course, that a blanket is only a blanket, and Cavell knows it too. It's what he calls, and I quote, a comic barrier, hardly more than a prop in a travelling salesman joke. Yet Cavell also wants it to be more, as it invokes for him issues of metaphysical isolation and the possibility of overcoming separateness. Indeed, he insists that it, quote, must invoke these issues if this film's comedy is to be understood. In the ensuing exploration of the senses borne by the blanket, three strands in particular emerge and are intertwined. The blanket is a limit to knowledge, separating us from what we cannot know. It is the transgressible boundary between selves. And finally, it serves to represent the movie screen onto which are projected our uncertainties and desires. I'll say something in turn about those three aspects of the blanket. So first, the blanket is a limit to knowledge. It prevents Gable and Colbert from seeing each other undress, and so seeing each other naked. It stands in the way of their carnal knowledge of each other. It is the barrier separating subjects from what they cannot or should not see. But as such, it is also, picking up the Kantian theme, the very condition of the knowledge a subject can have. By barring access to the unseen world, it also creates and delimits a space that can be known. Neither Colbert nor Gable can see beyond the barrier, but each of their separate worlds is fully visible and knowable to them. Secondly, the blanket is a boundary between selves. Gable insists on his privacy being delicate and annoyed by prying eyes. He does not wish to be seen as he undresses, though the camera dwells on him as long as it dares. He accords the same right to Colbert, though again the camera dwells as long as it dares. And interestingly, although Gable makes no attempt to see Colbert undress, in the sequence he does show a surprisingly comprehensive knowledge of men's habits of taking their clothes off. I leave that observation without further comment. This insistence on privacy is a refusal of intimacy, an unwillingness to see or to be exposed to the too present other. Even when asked, not unreasonably, what his name is, Gable initially talks around the question before giving it a straight answer, as if to speak his name, Peter Warne, is already to reveal too much of himself. Equally, the arousal of desire may be an unwelcome intrusion into one's privacy. Gable puts up the blanket not just out of politeness or respect for Colbert's modesty, but perhaps because he does not want to see her undress. He asks her to remove her clothes from his sight because they're too distracting. They make him too aware of the disquieting proximity of the other and the risks of losing oneself in desire. However, insofar as the blanket stands for the walls of Jericho, its fate is to be brought down once Joshua has sounded his horn. The film depicts this transgression of limits as possible, but no easy matter. In a later scene from the film, set in another motel room, Colbert listens to Gable's dream of an ideal woman, and wanting to be that woman, she steps around the blanket to enter his side of the room. Here, though, real and imaginary lives are too brutally confused. Gable rejects Colbert as she walks into his dreams. After she's returned to her separate bed, he reflects and changes his mind. He now wants to accept her as both a dream figure and a reality, to let her into his dreams and to make of his dreams something real. Yet he continues to withdraw from her, even as he longs to accept her. Strangely, rather than telling her that he's changed his mind, he leaves her asleep and goes off to secure some money which will enable them to be together, hoping to return before she awakes. Of course, he doesn't return before she awakes. In other words, he leaves her temporarily so that they can be together permanently. Cavell notes that Gable's actions here are not adequately explained, and although the film ends happily for the couple, with the walls of Jericho breached, his mysterious abandonment of her is a failure which remains, this is Cavell's phrase, an eye of pain, a source of suspicion and compromise haunting the happy end of this drama. In other words, the transgression of limits, and in the present context we might include in this the transgression of the limits of polite interpretation, can promise no definitive harmony. Thirdly, the blanket acts as a screen, standing for the movie screen, onto which fantasy is projected. It does not give access to a full vision of the thing itself, but it allows reality to be guessed at, even whilst it does not reveal it fully. Gable does not see Colbert undressing, but the hint of her body as the blanket moves when she brushes against it may be all the more erotic for being largely in the imagination. As the blanket both shows the presence of Colbert and the poignancy of her absence, Gable is in the position of the film's viewers, trying to make out a real woman from the partially visual, from her partially visible projected image. What Gable sees and what we see is both real and not real enough, the mark of something that it would be nonsensical to deny, but which is presented to us as out of our reach. This can then be related to Cavell's complex understanding of film's realism, elaborated in his book The World Viewed. In The World Viewed, Cavell argues that film is what he calls a moving image of skepticism, because it has a particular bearing on skeptical doubt concerning the existence or intelligibility of the world. Looking at the screen, we have an experience of the senses which meets our expectations and requirements of the external world, yet the world is not fully present to us. This presence-absence of reality, our absence from the world that seems present unto itself, encapsulates the skeptical dilemma. It realizes the fear that the world we hope to know is unavailable to us as we are unavailable to it. It projects reality in front of us, but keeps us separate from it. This is not to say that for Cavell there is no representation of reality in film. Such a view is, in his opinion, a fake skepticism, since it is blatant to him that photography, painting, or film may represent reality. To deny this is to deny the obvious. But this does not mean either that film refutes skepticism by offering to us a world which is available for us to know and to possess. That would be, as it were, a fake realism, as flawed as fake skepticism. Film is a moving image of skepticism precisely because it does not resolve the standoff between the desire to know the world and a sense of its retreat from us. Cavell here pointedly declines to diffuse the tension between skepticism, doubt in the existence of the external world, and realism, the confidence in the world's availability to us. It is what he calls a farce skepticism, to deny, and I quote, that it is ever reality which film projects and screens. Both projects and screens here are at least double-edged. Film projects reality by putting it up before us, but as a projection, something constructed rather than merely reflected. And reality is screened, both presented to us on a screen and screened from us, made inaccessible even as it is offered to us. This play on screening is then picked up in the following paragraph in a key sentence which perfectly encapsulates the complexity of Cavell's position. In screening reality, he says, film screens its givenness from us. It holds reality from us, it holds reality before us, i.e. withholds reality before us. The screen puts reality in front of us and bars our way towards it. Film withholds reality before us, in Cavell's phrase, because reality is at the same time held up for our attention and withheld from us. Film gives us a world, but it is a world which we do not possess and to which we do not belong. The blanket, then, in It Happened One Night, becomes a means for Cavell to engage with the dilemmas of skepticism, understood not as a philosophical position to be proven or refuted once and for all, but as a standing threat which can never be fully expelled from our relation to the world and others. The final paragraph of the essay on Capra's film, In Pursuits of Happiness, brilliantly puts together the three aspects of the blanket as a restriction of knowledge, a barrier between selves, and a screen onto which the world is projected. So this is Cavell. I would read the instruction of the barrier along these lines. What it censors is the man's knowledge of the existence of the human being on the other side. The picture, note the use of the word picture, the picture is that the existence of others is something of which we are unconscious, a piece of knowledge we repress, about which we draw a blank, note blank as well. This does violence to others. It separates their bodies from their souls, makes monsters of them, and presumably we do it because we feel that others are doing this violence to us. The release from this circle of vengeance is something I call acknowledgement. That's Cavell. So the picture he refers to in this final paragraph is surely the motion picture Cavell has been discussing. It draws a blank, or it draws a blanket, in order for the characters to shield themselves from what they do not wish to know about the existence of the other. Importantly, this is described as a piece of knowledge we repress. It is not something that cannot be known, but something that we choose not to know. Cavell's implicit departure from Kant here is that for Kant, the barrier cannot be overcome, since the truth of beings in themselves can never be known. For Cavell, the barrier can be transgressed, not to acquire knowledge of the noumenal or of unfathomable other minds, but to create a situation in which we might acknowledge the presence of others, that is, relate to others in their otherness. The outrageousness of Cavell's essay is not really that he discusses Kant alongside a Hollywood comedy. It is rather that he gives the final word in the debate to that Hollywood comedy, contriving to find in it a critical response to Kant, an insight as profound as Kant's, and one which is perhaps more humanly usable. It's essential to Cavell's stance that, with the right kind of receptive attention, one might learn something from a film like It Happened One Night, something which is every bit as incisive, persuasive, and relevant as what one might learn from Kant about the limitations of knowledge, about skepticism, about the possibilities of improving the self and creating a human society worth living in. Has Cavell gone too far? Can so much really be at stake in the blanket? I leave that question for you to decide for yourselves, but for Cavell would wish to argue that we grossly misunderstand the achievement of Hollywood films in the 1930s and 1940s if we do not acknowledge their intellectual seriousness. Overreading is imaginative and flexible. It may appear to disdain the standards of evidence and argument which most critics respect, but it is not entirely without rules, or at least without guiding thoughts. To conclude this talk, I want to list with only a minimum of comment some of what I call the maxims of overreading. That is, the maxims which to some measure unite the practitioners of critical excess. Some of these maxims are relatively uncontroversial, some less so. First, no form of evidence should be ruled out in principle or in practice. Biographical information, for example, was for a long time unfashionable, but it's certainly freely used by the overreaders. If it helps, use it. If it doesn't help, draw a discreet veil over it. Second, the potential of context to generate meaning is never exhausted. We might all agree that any interpretation should be appropriate to a work's context, but we might have greater difficulty agreeing precisely what is and isn't a context. In other words, we don't actually know what the word context means. Third, the boundaries between the inside and the outside of a work are never certain. Again, we might well agree that a critic shouldn't read into a work something that isn't really there. But how do we decide what is and isn't there? What is in Nietzsche's I've Forgotten My Umbrella, for example? Fourth, nothing is only what it seems. Everything is interpretable. A blanket may look as if it's only a blanket, but perhaps, in fact, it's the barrier separating the noumenal from the phenomenal worlds. Fifth, don't bother trying to persuade those who don't agree with you. This is perhaps where it gets a bit more wild. Don't bother trying to persuade those who don't agree with you. Deleuze, for example, high-handedly rules out discussion. This is Deleuze. Every time someone makes an objection to me, I want to say, okay, let's move on to something else. Objections have never produced anything positive. Less provocatively, but no less decisively, Cavell insists that sometimes you just get to the point where you have to say, this is how I see it, and leave it at that. Sixth, mistakes don't matter that much. After all, in matters of interpretation, we don't actually risk a great deal. Nobody dies, usually. The worst that is likely to happen is that we get ignored. The final two maxims are the key items of faith in the hermeneutics of overreading. 7, the work knows something. Perhaps it knows everything. The work repays the scrutiny to which it is subjected because it contains a kernel of knowledge that only the boldest interpretive pressure can attain. Zizek entitled a collection of essays he edited, "Everything you always wanted to know about Lacan, but were afraid to ask Hitchcock." Hitchcock will tell you about Lacan. Hitchcock will tell you everything about Lacan, if only you ask him in the right way. And 8th, finally, most importantly, believe. Frederick Jameson's imperative, always historicize, is replaced in overreading by always believe. For most of the overreaders, the faith in the text is not evidently religious, sometimes it is, but it is a faith nonetheless, and the acts of reading which it encourages are secular forms of adoration. This is why overreading is the precise opposite of the hermeneutics of suspicion. The aim of interpretation here is to listen to the work rather than to demystify it. This willingness to submit to the text may of course be a further mystification. It is, however, the enabling self-delusion which makes possible the gains of overreading, such as they are. The work of what I'm calling overreaders seems to me to be important for a number of reasons. It represents not the resolution of the ancient quarrel between philosophy and the arts, so much as one of the modern forms of the fraught, loving and suspicious relation between them. For all their expressions of respect for art, the philosophers I've been talking about are not ready to renounce a distinctive and privileged place for their own discipline. But they are willing to attend with the utmost devotion to works in media and idioms very different from their own. They all resist tying prestigious art to its historical epoch, so that they can explore ways in which a work may speak to us even if its originators could not have envisaged the terms in which it is made to resonate. They achieve a step beyond suspicion as they place their trust in works to which is now attributed the power to speak of what they know rather than merely to hide what they could not confront or conceive. Overreading must accept the risk that its results may be fatuous or silly, laughable or just plain dull. But on this matter, Cavell makes what is for me the definitive statement. In my experience, Cavell writes, people worried about reading in or over-interpretation or going too far are or were typically afraid of getting started, of reading as such, as if afraid that texts, like people, like times and places, mean things, and moreover, mean more than you know. This is accordingly a fear of something real. It may be a healthy fear, that is a fear of something fearful, but, Cavell concludes, still, my experience is that most texts, like most lives, are underread, not overread. The fear of overreading is a desire for containment, a longing for a stable, habitable world, unspoiled by the taint of noumenal unknownness. This would be a world from which the possibility of skepticism had been forever banished. Overreading, on the other hand, dreams of a Promethean foray into uncharted territory to steal or to recover some trace of a work's hitherto unspoken knowledge. It pushes at the limits of what can be said about the texts or films or people that matter to us, testing and refining our sensitivity to shards of meaning that risk going unheeded, extending the range of what might be known, heard, or felt. In the end, it is about learning to abide with the otherness of what is uncannily close, to recognize it as both intimately familiar and dizzyingly strange. Thank you.